Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about, I think, a pretty important topic, set of ideas that have a lot of relevance for us today. If ideas have importance, then how we conceptualize society, how we conceptualize family, the community, ethnicity, and nationality, these can be pretty important. If any ideas are important, then these conceptions are important. Today we are, well, I think we feel ourselves pulled by at least two forces. I say the conservative force is a force that wants to reinforce the importance of tradition, and that means the family, and that means national traditions as well. Could be religious traditions, national traditions, ethnic traditions. And then the other extreme, of course, would be the left wing, which wants to undermine or eradicate those differences. Now, I'm not saying that these two polarities are undifferentiated in themselves. They certainly are. You can become a globalist for different reasons. There's globalists who want to maximize their company's profit or their personal profit through exploiting labor in the third world and making products cheaply to sell to the wealthier nations. That's different than the internationalism of Marxism, for instance. Marxism has always wanted to run over differences, any difference that wasn't an economic difference. So they said the family wasn't important, marriage isn't important, ethnicity, religion, none of these things are important. All that matters is the wealthy versus the poor, or the worker versus the owner, right? And international Marxism has always been international in a way. The importance of the Marxist International or the Socialist International was, well, that was the prominent Marxist institution up until the Russian Revolution, when the International Marxist Organization was subsumed by the Russian Soviet. Okay, so the Russian Soviet took over and eliminated the International Marxist Organization as the primary interpreter of Marxism or communism. But the bottom line is the importance of the global reach of Marxism. And it's interesting, Marxism is very much a religious, has some features of a religion, in the sense that, like Christianity or like Islam, it is ambitious of sort of conquering or spreading its influence worldwide, whereas other institutions are quite content to stay within their own milieu, right? And of course, like Judaism would be a pretty good example of that. That Judaism has always been typically, well, since after King David anyway, has typically been ethnic and regionalized, and that the worldwide Judaism is simply a survival mechanism. It's a diaspora, an unchosen diaspora in a way that was brought about through persecution and so on, and having really no homeland of their own, which is the importance of Israel, for instance, today. There are other places and other institutions like that, and within the big religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, there are elements that are quite content to stay within their own milieu. And of course, then there are those institutions that are sort of confused about what they want to do, and that they conflate their setting with the religion itself or with the organization itself. You know, you could use examples from anything, but that you'd want to take, for instance, a particular version of Islam or Christianity or something, and turn it evangelical, so go, evangelize parts of Africa or South America or something, and in a way sort of set up the exact Sitzenleben, or the life situation of, say, Arabian Islam, where it doesn't really fit very well, so say in the rainforest in the Amazon, or say bourgeois Parisian Catholicism in wherever, in Buenos Aires or Lagos, Sri Lanka, or someplace, right? So, nevertheless, the conception of community, whether you understand yourself first and foremost as a Catholic or a Christian or Muslim or Canadian or English speaker or Celtic or Londoner, Torontonian, New Englander, Mormon, Southern Baptist, or member of the Kennedy family or the Windsor family, whatever it is that your primary community is, however you define yourself, these have important implications, of course, for the way you conduct yourself, for your allegiances, for your morality. So that's kind of what this article by Jesse Russell is about. Aquinas on Kinship and Caritas. Caritas, of course, is one of the Latin words for love. It is the word that, for instance, St. Augustine preferred when speaking of the Christian virtue that Jesus talks about. So Caritas is translated in two different ways in English. One is love, which is the correct one, and the other one is charity, which is not correct anymore, since we define charity most often as the giving of alms to the poor. So in this article, as someone properly steeped in the Catholic tradition, the author Jesse Russell will often speak about the difference between charity in the Catholic tradition of caritas as love, and charity in the modern sense as almsgiving. I think I've noticed one time where the author made a mistake and used charity in the wrong sense, but that is the pretty consistent approach of Catholic scholars today, is to distinguish charity as almsgiving from charity as love. And that's an important word in the Catholic tradition. It's not as important in other Christian traditions and, of course, other religions. It's a very Catholic, it's a very Latin Catholic word, charity, at least the way we're using it. Well, for Catholics, it's a very important word. Anyway, so the initial or the essential paradigm or tension in the title, Kinship and Caritas, is basically, so you have Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century theologian, the most authoritative theologian in the Catholic tradition, talking about kinship, which is a particular thing, right? Your kin is your family, your neighborhood, your community, your tribe. And caritas connotes the universal love of the gospel. So the commitment, the orientation of followers of the gospel and members of the church, the universal commitment to love all as one's neighbor and to spread the gospel throughout the whole world. And we remember the different universalizing tendencies in the gospel where Jesus, and especially in the book of Acts, where the apostles are slowly learning that this isn't a Jewish gospel, it's a world gospel. And eventually, slowly, the apostles realize this. St. Paul seems to realize it before Peter and James, but they eventually realize it as well, that this isn't a Jewish thing anymore, that this is a universal thing. So there's neither Greek nor Jew, slave or free, man or woman, but the gospel is for everybody. So that's a real thing in history. It's a real strong moment, especially when that's the essential dynamic of the book of Acts, is realizing that we're switching communities here. We're switching from the particular community of Israel, of Palestine, of Jerusalem and Galilee, and we're turning outward. And so the gospel did very quickly. The evangelists spread outward, and they took the gospel to Rome, to Antioch, to Rome, to Alexandria, and even outward towards Persia and apparently towards India with the Apostle Thomas. I don't know if that's actually historically true, but the Indian Catholics certainly believe it's true. And the tradition has been that, the apostles had brought Catholicism to all the important places and set up important bishoprics, that St. Andrew established the church in Moscow and somehow also established the church in Scotland. I think a few other places as well. That the Apostle James is somehow strongly attached to Spain. What else? Thomas in India, the Apostle Mark in Alexandria, Peter and Paul both in Rome. But anyway, so you have that universalizing tendency. Now, as we know today, when we talk about ethnicity, we are coming out of the 20th century where ethnicity has been a very bad thing. That ethnicity was behind the horrors of Nazism. And we can also think of the bad aspects of tribalism or kinship or ethnicity when we think of places like Ireland, Northern Ireland, or we can think of places like Rwanda, and even today South Africa, and a million other places like the Balkans. And all the negative things that sometimes it's not just ethnicity, but it's ethnicity tied with religion. And I think today in Canada, for instance, we'd always had different types of religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, but especially Anglicans. In Canada, it's also been something between French-speaking Catholics and English-speaking Protestants. But now you'll find that the main divisions in Canada are class differences. So you can really see it at times, like with the truckers protests last year. And the Prime Minister's response, this was two strata of society butting heads. This was the Ottawa elite versus blue-collar workers. And you'll find that that's the case a lot, and that's really been behind the differences in the United States, for instance, between the two parties, whereas the Republicans and the Democrat parties have sort of switched over the last 20 years, beginning with Bill Clinton, that the so-called left-wing party, the Democrat Party, has switched allegiances to the wealthy, and the Republican Party has more oriented itself towards the blue-collar people, so that the base of support for these parties has really switched over the last 20 years. That the Democrats represent the coastal elites, while the Republicans are more representing the flyover states and blue-collar workers and so on. So it's been a real switch over the last 20 years. So anyway, in different places, we have the self-fulfilling prophecy of Karl Marx that the primary division is between the rich and the poor, between the workers and the owners. So, in a way, the question that the author of this article, Russell, is asking is, how should a Christian, or more particularly, how can a Catholic understand these differences? How must he understand differences of ethnicity, of nationhood, in light of history, and in light of the church's universality, right? So if you think any ideas are important, then probably this one is important. So let me just quote the second page of the article. It says, the angelic doctor, that's the nickname of St. Thomas Aquinas, lays out a vision of community that is attentive to the claims of kinship and community. This vision further simultaneously allows for a transcendence of these natural bonds of family and folk into the realm of a deeper and more lasting sense of human community as perfected in the bonds and love within the church. And he says, as a result, Thomistic thought can provide much needed groundwork for Catholic engagement with the wider global theopolitical discussion. So Aquinas recognizes the importance of ethnic identity, but he also emphasizes a community that is broader and more important than the tribe, the church. Okay, so Aquinas has a view which needs to say that the difference between Greek and Jew is irrelevant. In fact, he says something quite different from that, but also he doesn't sacrifice the universality of the gospel and the mission of the church, right? So he says on the next page that Aquinas lays out an explanation of the virtue of piety. And piety it's a funny thing though. When people think of piety today, they think of piety as being religiously observant. But piety comes from basically the attitude that it's just a general attitude of loyalty to father. So it's the virtue of a son to a father. So the virtue of piety is the love of father, which translates as well into the love of the fatherland. So he says that piety provides a window into his thinking about how human communities are formed and the obligations that people have for one another. He says that man is a debtor chiefly to his parents and his country after God. And he says that piety requires one to give worship to one's parents and one's country. Worship is just a strong word today for love or loyalty. There's an interesting point here in the same paragraph on this third page. Aquinas is not a liberal or postmodern individualist who sees relationships as being predicated upon free choice or volitional contracts. That's really key here. That's perhaps the most important sentence in this whole article. So what does that mean? Well, today, don't we have the idea that we choose our communities? How often do people say, if President X gets elected, I'm moving to Canada? Or if this person's elected governor, I'm moving to this state? Or if Ontario doesn't stop doing this, I'm moving to Calgary or something. If my family does X, then I'm going to cut them off. Okay? These are very modern attitudes, and they're possible to us because they're economically possible. But in the 13th century world, the worst penalty was exile. Well, short of execution, because exile removed you from every safety net you had, and that was basically people who knew you and who cared about you. It was a very dangerous thing to travel in the pre-modern world because people didn't know who you were. They were afraid of you. They didn't know why you weren't in your village. And there's the two sides of that, is that it looks like you're running away from responsibility. Like, why are you here when you're not from here? Are you running away from your responsibilities? And why are you doing that? Is it because you're a criminal, or are you a spy? Okay, so we look at these things as very antiquated ideas, like the amount of times that strangers are considered spies in the Old Testament world, and actually are spies, is that there's no reason for someone to be outside of their community, outside of their village, outside of their farmstead, because people needed you and you needed people, right? When you're on subsistence agrarian economy, then you can't just be willy-nilly traveling about. But today, because we have bank accounts, we have access them by phone or online or interact, we have visas that allow us to get money all over the world, then we're not tied to any place, and that we can make new friends, we can get new jobs. People travel regularly, airplanes transfer people, cars transfer people very easily, and with low cost, relatively speaking. The idea that you're essentially tied to your family, to your village, to your particular community was common sense in the pre-modern world. And let's take an example of today in Catholicism, the parish. Catholics today generally are supposed to be a member of the church community in which they live. So I live within the boundaries of a certain church, so I'm a member of that church. And traditionally that meant that the priest, the pastor of that church, was the one responsible to decide whether I got communion or not. And he could make those judgments because he would know whether I went to confession or not, because he's the only priest I was allowed to go to. And if I didn't make confession at Easter, or just before Easter, I wasn't allowed to receive communion. I couldn't get married in the church, which was the only marriage anyone recognized. And if I wasn't a member in good standing, people wouldn't associate with me. They wouldn't hire me. They wouldn't work with me. They wouldn't allow me to marry their daughter, that type of thing. Whereas today, these bonds are very weak. And so today, people choose their parishes. If you don't like the priest at one church, you get in your car and you drive for 5 minutes to the next church. So the importance of the parish is extremely minimal compared to previous times, pre-modern times, and that some vestiges of Catholicism haven't really comprehended that switch, so that if you read canon law, the importance of the parish as laid out in canon law is not reflected in the reality of daily life. And in fact, the importance of the bishop, a fortiori, many people today just never, who the bishop is irrelevant. But in canon law, he is everything. He is the pope of the local church. But now he's nearly irrelevant to daily life, right? Even of a Catholic. Okay, so these what we would call relationships predicated upon free choice. We can choose to play baseball or soccer. We can choose to be a member of whatever group in your community. You can be members of virtual communities, so different groups online. You can be members of different Reddit communities. You can be members of different organizations online. You can be members of professional communities. And these are all choices that they don't bring about any obligation that you can't reverse. And of course, this also feeds into marriage, right? So marriage as in its social form is dead, because you can unmarry. Now, in the old world and in the reality of the marital contract, both within pagan and in the Christian world, was irrevocable, and it was something that not only put obligations on you, but gave you rights. Of course, a woman wanted to get married because it put her in a good social position. And right now, as some of you might know, I'm reading Jane Austen's Persuasion, and it's interesting to see how women viewed marriage 200 years ago and think about how it's viewed today. And for as much as Hollywood wants to make us think that the past was bad and that marriage was a kind of imprisonment, these women wanted to get married. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why did they want to get married? Obviously, it was beneficial to them. But on the other hand, the author, Jane Austen, she didn't get married. She chose not to get married. She was asked once and she said yes, and then the next day she said, I've changed my mind. And it appears that, well, she wasn't madly in love with the person, but it appears also that she thought that she wouldn't be able to write anymore if she was a wife, because wife equals mother, and mother is a full-time job, right? In a pre-birth control world, motherhood and marriage and motherhood meant something. Okay? These are inevitable responsibilities, and you can't choose. Once they're chosen, you can't unchoose them, right? And you can't choose your community in the older world, and you can't unchoose it, because the community was essential, was beneficial, and essential to you, and you were essential to the community. So how does the church, asks Russell, how is the church supposed to respond to this new world where most relationships are viewed as volitional? Aquinas, let's get further into it. He says on the same page 3, the bond of kinship for Aquinas is not simply one among many co-equal bonds. Rather, it is the key basis and foundation of human community. Like Aristotle, Aquinas sees humans as fundamentally social animals, And he says that no man is sufficient unto himself. And he says also, Aquinas lays out a patchwork of social formation, beginning with the household or family, followed by the city, which is the perfect community, and finally the province. The family is headed by a father, the province is ultimately headed by a king. It's interesting how he says province rather than nation or country, because I think Aquinas realizes that the whole world is a kind of unity under the Pope and the Emperor, so that a king can't really be the head of a country, but of a province, right? So a king is under the Emperor and the Pope in a way. The ruler of a household is called father, not king, although he bears a certain resemblance to the king, for which reason kings are sometimes called the fathers of their people. So this makes a lot more sense when you think about how much people are dependent upon each other. So further down on the next page, there's an interesting comparison to John Locke. And in Locke's second treatise on government, he says, or an interpreter says, that Locke offers a rationalistic view of human political life that has abstracted away every bond that ties human beings to one another, then consent. Locke and some of the rationalistic philosophers wanted to explain politics philosophically. And so philosophy has to do with the mind, morality with choice, and so they wanted to ground their understanding of politics according to those two things alone, to reason and choice. So Locke means that the individual becomes a member of a human collective only because he has agreed to it, and has obligations towards such collectives only if he has accepted them. And the author then says that this is unbiblical. The Bible systematically promotes the idea that members of a nation should regard one another as brothers. Okay, you don't choose the nation that you were born into, but there's a certain fittingness to it. The fact that you're born, rural Ontarian or rural Ontarian Catholic, rural Ontarian Catholic, Polish speaker, whatever. These are all things about you that you didn't choose, but then they form who you are, and they inform some of the responsibility you have as a human being. Okay, so it's interesting how much Aquinas and Aristotle agree with each other in a way, and I think they don't necessarily agree with each other because on philosophical grounds, but I say they agree with each other because they're both very pre-modern, right? So Aristotle, Aquinas, and I'd say Plato, they believe that the first society to be formed is the village. So the village comes from a unity of families that are oriented towards supplying the daily needs of the families and of the family members. And then the village becomes a city through an extended family joined together by marriage and kinship. At the bottom of the 6th page, the author says, reason follows the directives of nature, which indicate that the village is ultimately rooted in the family, which itself has marriage as its foundation. So isn't that interesting? That the village is rooted in the family by the directives of nature, not by the directives of choice, but by the directives of nature. So Aquinas couldn't agree with Locke and say you get to choose your communities. No, nature thrusts them upon you. And the author will say later on, or somewhere in this article, oh yes, he does, on the 7th page of the article, he says somewhere that basically nature and grace are both creations of God, so that God's will for people follows or works in parallel with his will through nature. So he created nature and he created the moral order so that the two have a great deal to do with each other, right? So that grace fulfills nature, right? So he says that a patchwork of ethnic blocks are united together for the sake of the good life and human flourishing. So it's not that, according to Aquinas and Aristotle, it's not that kinship is important in and of itself. Well, it is, but he says on its theological fitness, okay, on the theological fitness of the state, that the village, the community, the city-state, the nation or province have a teleological fitness, meaning that they serve our nature. According to Aristotle, the nature of the thing is its end. What a thing is supposed to be is to be according to its nature. Okay, so it's man's nature to be a social animal, so he has to live in society. And he says that the human being has to be able to realize his potential, and that the state, the community, the village, the family, the kin group allows a person to reach his potential. So he says that the state is a creation of nature because man is by nature a political animal. So contrary to Locke, the state is not created by choice. The state is created by nature. Yeah, those are very important differences. And he says that villages have to yoke together to form a state because, for this very reason, that fulfilling human end and serving human nature, that the state, that the village alone or the kin group alone can't fulfill human nature, but a state is needed to really fulfill human requirements. So you could look at that through a variety of ways. I suppose in the modern world we could say, well, we need a nation or we need a state because otherwise we can't provision for medical care, or we can't provision for nuclear power, or form an army to protect us against other states, or to have universities to educate people at a high level. That can't be done on a village basis, for instance. Whatever examples you want to use. Okay, so yeah, so it's on page, on the 8th page of the article, it says that grace and virtue imitate the order of nature. Another author that the author Russell quotes says that Aquinas did not view the order of charity as a simple system of concentric circles in which family and members of one's own household come first, next to close friends, neighbors, associates, and finally the outward radiating gradations of various relations to the self. He says that there's different, like it's just not a perfect arrangement of concentric circles, that there are different priorities. And he gives a good example, for instance, that it's more important to help a stranger who's dying than to help your father who is perfectly fine. So that's a great example of how these circles of loyalty or kinship aren't simply gradations which are absolutes, right? So it's more of a patchwork, the author says on the 9th page. So communities are reinforced by friendship and collaborative labor towards a common good. And on the 10th page, Aquinas emphasizes the importance of directing charity towards those who are closer to God than to others. This is an interesting point here, where Aquinas is making a move from thinking about community identity as a natural thing, and then one as a supernatural thing or a religious thing. So he throws this in. He says that, Aquinas says that we ought to give alms to one who is much holier and in greater want, and to one who is more useful to the common weal, rather than to one who is closely united to us, right? And that's where he uses the example of the father or whatever. If your father is healthy and good, it's more important to give alms to someone who is further removed from you, but in need, right? And I find the whole thing of obligation towards the holier to be interesting. So I suppose that if you have one piece of bread or one apple, that you should give it not to the drunk philanderer, but to the holy monk who prays all day or whatever. It makes the community better, right? It serves the community, makes the community better than one who makes it worse. And then he switches to on page 10, he switches to talking about heaven, how that correlates to our understanding of our community in the world. So if we're supposed to love the holier more or better than the unholy in this world, that's also a fact in heaven, where he says that one will also love better men more than himself. So someone in heaven will love better men more than he loves himself. And yet the author here wants to reinforce the basic Christian universalizing concepts as well. And he says on page 12 that charity binds us, though not actually doing good to someone, to be prepared in mind to do good to anyone if we have time to spare. So our first obligations are to those next to us, our family, and then our village or our community or neighborhood or village and so on. But we have, as Christians, we have to be prepared in mind to do good to anyone, right? And so you can think here of the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the Samaritan is not a member of my community in any sense of the word, but finding the person in need, that person becomes my neighbor. Sort of moving towards a conclusion, this Thomistic vision of charity, which takes account of the importance of kinship, can serve as a grounding for Christian theopolitical discussion. Aquinas' starting point is charity, not economic interest or chauvinism, right? So even though talking about Aristotle and the natural basis of our communities to fulfill human nature, we also have to see that the starting point is not economic, but love. We don't serve each other because it's in our own self-interest, but we serve each other out of love. And on the 14th page, he quotes, he says that, Aquinas says that humans are made godlike by charity and are further thus made above mere men. So this is the key element, he says, in contemporary political, the key missing element in contemporary political discourse, even amongst Catholics. The emphasis on charity as the most profound solvent in human and broader political relationships. And he spends some time reorienting it into the modern context of Catholic teaching and of secular philosophy. And on the 17th page of the 18-page article, he says, "It is only through the many national experiments that we can learn over historical time what is in fact best. For Aquinas, what is truly best is found through not reason, but ultimately revelation. And what is truly best is God, who is ultimately reached through the gift of charity. For Aquinas, charity is the foundation of ethics, and charity limits and tames ethnic chauvinism, while offering a way in which the various diverse peoples of the world can cohere." He writes a conclusion which ties it up neatly. So in the end, we can understand, well, obviously that Aquinas' teaching on kinship and community is naturalistic, so one that looks at the fulfillment of human nature, which says that first the family is the most important, or the first important institution, and then the village or the neighborhood, and then it sort of spirals out from there. And this is natural because it fulfills our nature not just materialistically, but educationally, religiously, virtuously, or morally, but that the bottom line is not economic self-interest, but love. So there you go. Do you think this helps you in sort of understanding and navigating political discourse today? Can you see these considerations being partially present in different, even competing doctrines? That conservatism wants to focus on both the economic rationale of human nature and the moral rationale of human nature, and that so does, say, Marxism, and so does liberal globalism, but they all have different interpretations of what those things are and how they fulfill human nature. So there you have it. I hope you've learned something from this. I hope hope it gets your little mental machinery flowing, and maybe it'll get you thinking about things or looking at things in a different way. Hope you guys have a great day, and we will talk to you soon.